So the major reason I had you guys watch that video was to show that there is a large cultural component to ageism as well. Like I mentioned before, advancements in healthcare have led to an overall increase in older workers in the workforce due to the retirement age growing. But also in our culture, numerous stereotypes exist, like I mentioned before. People often view younger people as being rebellious, or not thinking before they act, or being unwise, or stupid. Or they're often not trusted with certain tasks because of their age. Whereas older people are often viewed as having weaker memories, being senile, being useless. And this kind of goes back to the collectivist versus individualistic debate that I mentioned before. Basically, people assert that Western society, such as America, has a more individualistic, self-serving culture. So when their older family members become unwell or can't take care of themselves as much as they used to, they're often pushed into retirement homes or communities out of sight. Whereas Asian countries such as Japan or Korea have more collectivist cultures. So when their family members become sick or unwell, they are often brought into the home because of more collectivist culture. So basically what these solutions are meant to do, sort of like the college community, is to just simply raise awareness and combat these stereotypes. And these are meant to target schools, places of employment. They're also meant to create new company policies that prohibit discrimination and have mandatory training. Now, of course, training doesn't necessarily solve everything, but it is definitely a step in the right direction, I believe. And also one of the major ones also discussed is financial incentives to employers. This basically means that employers now will receive more money or receive sort of financial incentives to hire older people. So there's a financial reason to hire older people. And lastly, just simply having conversations and relationships with different age groups can definitely help combat some of these stereotypes and biases. Like I mentioned before, the college communities and the retirement communities coming together is definitely a great way of combating this stereotypes and just leading to a more open and accepting and understanding culture. So one of the more interesting points that I found regarding ageism is the fact that some people actually distinguish between types of discrimination. For example, some people distinguish direct versus indirect discrimination, whereas direct is more overt, in your face, you can't get this job because of your age group. Whereas indirect is more covert. It's policies that apply to everybody but hurt specific age groups. An example of that would be a job requiring a certain reading ability or certain lifting requirement, be able to lift a certain amount of weight, which of course may hurt the chances of an older person getting the job. Another interesting point that I found is that social support can actually act as a buffer for age discrimination. This sort of goes back to the stress process model, whereas social support acts as a moderating resource for discrimination and can lead to less consequences, such as anxiety and depression, lower levels of that. But this, honestly, a lot of it goes back to just simple lack of knowledge, like I said before. This sort of lack of knowledge about age and how just this lack of knowledge leads to higher levels of prejudice, of course. So this sort of goes back to the multi-generational housing, just simply talking with an older person or meeting with them or getting to know them can sort of get past this lack of knowledge and this ignorance that some people may have and allow them to open their mind and see past some of these stereotypes. What's interesting, actually, is that the effects of racism were actually found to be diminishing faster than ageism, which is insane to think about. But ageism may be socially acceptable in many ways, yet, like I said, the lack of knowledge and stereotypes have been found to affect this majorly, more above anything else. And the same study, as I mentioned before, it found that actually no evidence that ageism is more socially accepted than racism. So even though it may be diminishing faster than ageism, they are both sort of not necessarily, one is not necessarily more acceptable than the other, despite notions that ageism is more accepted. So that's definitely an interesting point there. And lastly, it's the public support option. So basically my hypothesis on that is that most people will be in support of combating age discrimination, mostly because it is a form of discrimination, and I feel like most people would simply just be against all forms of discrimination. Of course, it may be more accepted in certain instances, depending on party and affiliation and things like that, which we'll talk more about in a second. So one of the most important things to consider when presenting your policy or solution to a certain politician is their party affiliation, as Congress is often split right down the middle between liberals and conservatives. Of course, liberals representing Democrats usually, and people on the right, conservatives usually representing the Republican Party. But what's interesting is that there's actually different kinds of ageism that were found between the parties. But my hypothesis on this is that both will be in support of this, like I said earlier, but that liberals or Democrats will be slightly more supportive of this due to the Liberal/Democrat Party being more focused on social policy and money spent, whereas Republicans often tend to be more about foreign affairs and internal affairs and less taxation, less money spent. What's interesting, like I said before, is that two types of ageism exist in the parties, whereas liberals were found to have compassionate ageism. This is sort of, basically like it sounds, it's more compassionate, but it's still ageism. So it's sort of being compassionate toward an older individual, saying that they are in need of care, and that since they're older, they need care and they need a retirement home or they need certain privileges because of this. Whereas you see where they're coming from, but you can see how it can definitely be misconstrued as ageism as well. Whereas the conservatives tend to have more of the traditional intergenerational ageism, sort of more just, certain generations are better, certain ages are better, things like that. But both sides of the spectrum are theorized to be against any form of discrimination, like I said before, especially in the workplace, despite the complicity of many people. And another evidence in support of this is the bipartisan support. Like I said, Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress signed the ADEA in 1967. This had major bipartisan support and definitely shows that both sides can be willing to come together and fight this ageism. And so we arrive at the question, is ageism unavoidable? Now, some people assert that it is unavoidable due to the sheer prevalence of it, as well as it can be found in pretty much every nation. Now, I believe that we can't really necessarily look at it like this. I can't really say for sure if it is unavoidable or avoidable, but I believe we have to treat it as if it is avoidable and that it is something that we can combat and defeat. Because there are a lot of benefits of aging and older workers. Like I said, older people have a lot of wisdom. They're fun to talk to. They're really good with customers sometimes. They're good with certain puzzles. They don't have a significant memory decline. They don't have significant coordination decline usually. They're usually solid workers. Most studies that I observed found very actually little difference between the age groups. Like I said before, simply that there's positives and negatives to both different ones. Like I said, younger people may have better memories, but older people may have better with certain puzzles, such as crosswords and things like that. And this just goes back to aging being something that we can all relate to. That's the thing. We're all aging every second. All of us age. And this should be something that we can relate to, which is why I believe that this will have a lot of support. And this sort of goes back to just the fear of aging, which I believe a lot of us have. A lot of us view aging as something bad, and I believe that sort of goes back to the stereotypes and the biases and the reason why so many of us are just complicit with this age discrimination. Some of us do have this fear of aging, and I believe that it's not necessarily something that we need to be fearful of. And I believe, like I said, simply talking with an older individual or getting to know somebody or just simply being more knowledgeable about the subject can sort of possibly help combat this fear of aging, and that may go a long way in helping to become a better society and more open. And so all of this largely just goes back to the question of why hire older workers? A lot of employers may be asking themselves that question because why hire older workers? They might say to themselves that younger people have education fresh on the brain, they're newer, they're younger, they have more of their lives ahead of them, they have better memory or coordination. Like I mentioned before, a lot of those are stereotypes and not true. One of the major reasons to hire older workers is like the wisdom and people skills that a lot of older people may possess. Another reason are the financial incentives that I mentioned before. A lot of companies getting financial incentives to hire older people and diversify their age group and their employers. And like I mentioned before, also job performance and settlements. Job performance is largely affected by ageism. It can make job performance and efficiency go down, thus leading to less finances. Also, settlements being paid millions of dollars sometimes unnecessarily, and it can be avoided. But also, an older person can care about a position just as much as any other age group. Also, same thing with health differences. Health differences are largely irrelevant because a younger person may be just as healthy as an older person and vice versa. It really doesn't matter. Although there may be some averages that are different based on age groups and diseases, it really is largely irrelevant. And this goes back to the merit versus seniority promotions. A lot of people say that promotions should be based on merit rather than seniority. A lot of places right now, they give promotions based on just who's been there the longest, who's the oldest, which is actually discriminatory versus younger people in this case. A lot of people argue for merit, and I largely agree with that in most instances. And it all just goes back to it just having the importance to have a very diverse employee base, just especially in customer service. When you're representing other people, you want to be representative of your customer service base. It can lead to better transactions and more understanding. And lastly, we just have some general discussion points here, some interesting topics. One of the major things to consider when examining ageism is the role of media. Similar to other forms of discrimination, it's important to examine media and how that may affect culture and perception. And you see often old people are portrayed as their stereotypes. Same thing with young people. In characters in movies and TV shows, older people are often portrayed as senile. They're sometimes portrayed as wise as well, but also portrayed as senile or crazy. Whereas younger people often are, again, they're stereotyped and portrayed as being sort of rebellious and more stupid. And there's also this notion of successful aging, which sort of should just be really gotten rid of because it implies that there's a really one correct way to successfully age. And this whole notion of successful aging and being a successful elderly person really doesn't make too much sense, and it helps just sort of add to this bias and stereotype about aging. But actually, ageism has been found to decrease job satisfaction and job performance as well. So this goes back to those financial incentives. So not only are people being offered financial incentives to hire older people, but also if they are experienced discrimination in the workplace, it decreases their job satisfaction and their performance. So combating this discrimination can also help increase job performance and company efficiency. And there's also, of course, tons of future implications, tons of future policy implications that I talked about before, just general discussion that needs to be had. One of the major other talking points is the punishment, saying that certain employees or companies should be punished for being caught age discrimination, being caught conducting that. But of course, this has some definitely debate. Some people say that this is useless and it may not work, that it really wouldn't do anything, that it doesn't help solve any kind of other kind of discrimination, so it wouldn't really do much for this. Again, I have not too much opinion on that, but the important thing is to begin the discussion. And how to begin that is kind of difficult because, like I said before, it's not necessarily talked about that often. So I think it just starts with just talking with one another. Like I said, one of the good things is the intergenerational housing, just sort of talking with one another, making it a goal to meet a different age group and talk with them. Things like that can definitely help add up and just help create just a culture of welcoming and just help combat this ageism that's so prevalent in the world.